Socioeconomic status, perceived student effort, parent involvement, and teacher opinion have all played a role in the support some of my students receive. Practices like this can lead to disproportionality in special ed. Many studies have called attention to disproportionality in special education around the world. Kmuzik et al. 2017 defines disproportionality as the over or underrepresentation of a group in an educational category, program, or service. This is determined by comparing the size of a group's population within educational services to the population as a whole. Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 2004 identified overrepresentation of minority groups in special ed as a concern. State and local educational agencies are now required to determine and report out the presence of significant disproportionality based on race. There is some gray area within policy, though, as it does not identify what significant disproportionality is. Researchers Cook and Crew looked for disproportionality in student eligibility, school placements, so that's whether special schools, students attend special schools, or if they're in resident district, and through disciplinary data. Policy focuses on overrepresentation, but students can be underrepresented in special ed based on race, gender, language, or any other identifiable category that intersects with their ability. Cook and Crew in 2018 synthesized research and data from studies on disproportionality in the U.S. They discovered male students were overrepresented in special ed. They made up nearly 2/3 of the U.S. special education population. They also found that students receiving free and reduced lunches were more likely to qualify for special ed services. According to the National Center on Educational Statistics, U.S. school populations are 1% Indigenous, 15% Black, 46% white. Researchers Conley, Kmizik, Cook, and Crew found that on average, Indigenous students make up 13%, Black students make up 11.4%, and white students make up 8.2% of schools' special ed populations. When you compare the special ed populations to overall student populations, these findings point to disproportionality in the qualification process. Researchers Conley, Ford, and Russo found a relationship between race and disability category. Black and Indigenous students were more likely to qualify under high-incidence disabilities, which include intellectual and emotional behavioral disorders. Black students were 2 times as likely to qualify or be diagnosed in these areas than any other group of students. Students who are served under high-incidence disability categories, which we just established is more statistically probable for students of color, are often served outside of the general education setting. This leads to a relationship between race and exclusionary practices within schools. Conley 2021 examined the structure of the identification process through the lens of critical theory. She found multidisciplinary decision-making, assessment and data collection, and categorical identification of emotional disturbance as potential causes for inequitable qualification processes. Her findings, along with bias, structural inequities, and teacher race, all contribute to disproportionality in special ed. Researchers Harry and Fenton and Kmuzik highlighted some possible structural influences, including sociodemographics, family issues, school resources and funding, professional preparation, and administrator policies as contributors to over and underrepresentation of certain student populations. Furthermore, in her 2007 article, Billings discusses the inequalities that are perpetuated by our system of educational debt and cultural deficit theories. Both of these factors could also contribute to disproportionality in special ed. Researchers Elder and Fish looked at the impact teacher race can have on the populations of students receiving special ed services. Fish found that increased teacher representation may alleviate some disproportionality concerns. Dr. Jennifer Ebenhart informed research around unconscious bias and the role it plays in our lives. Educators are not immune to the effects of unconscious bias, and therefore neither is the identification process in special education. Conley 2021 discussed a study done by Morgan et al. In 2015 that found that Black students were not overrepresented in special education, but that they were underrepresented. These researchers argued that more Black students would need to receive special education services in order to make the process and the educational system as a whole equitable. Elder et al. 2020 found that student over or underrepresentation in special education was dependent upon the school's student population. If students from racially and ethnically diverse backgrounds were the minority of a school population, they tended to be overrepresented in special ed. If Black students specifically were the majority of a school population, they were underrepresented in special education. According to the Moral Code of Ethics, 2015, educators must advocate for equitable educational opportunities, protect students from any practice that harms them, close opportunity gaps, demonstrate a commitment to equality, equity, inclusion, and respect diversity. The presence of disproportionality in special education defies this code of ethics and points to a larger ethical dilemma that cannot be ignored. So, what can we do? IDEA's definition of racial disproportionality is vague and leaves room for interpretation. Policy change that better defines and outlines what disproportionality in special ed looks like is a must to address this problem. Schools also need clear structures in place for MTSS and special education qualification practices. I think this should include decision-making rubrics or guidance to limit outside influences. I do not have specific resources to tackle an issue as complex as disproportionality in special ed. I believe that this issue can be addressed through the education of teachers, administrators, and other stakeholders who are part of the IEP evaluation process and decision-making. Sharing concepts we learned within this class, including anti-racism, educational debt, and the moral code of ethics, and information on bias could be a step in the right direction.